Ray is working on some of this technology that's beyond my comprehension, so, right on, Ray. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Chris Hamel, the leader of our Workers' World branch here in Detroit and a managing editor of Workers' World Party, Workers' World newspaper. Sorry, you should have written this out for me, her bio. Anyway, but she did attend a women's conference in Venezuela a few years back. So she'll be our first speaker on Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan Revolution in Perspective. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, comrades and friends. You can go online to Workers' World newspaper at workers.org or to other progressive media, even ruling class, capitalist-owned media, and read about the life and achievements of Hugo Chavez and what he meant to the people of Venezuela and the peoples of Latin America, the global south, and the world. I won't attempt to chronicle his history, the mighty aspirations, dogged determination, strength of will, and more that was Comandante Presidente Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. Chavez was the founder of the Fifth Republic Movement Party and then a member of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. President of Venezuela from 1999 until his death from cancer on March 5th, 2013, at the too young age of 58. Chavez was a beacon of light, hope, and struggle in a world in desperate need of liberation and socialism, for which he stood and for which he dedicated his life. I might be a little more personal in my tribute tonight, because when my spouse shouted from the living room at 4:35 p.m. on Tuesday, March 5th, that Chavez had died, I could only choke back my tears for a few moments. Right away, I contacted the week's managing editor of Workers' World, and immediate plans were made and put into action to change the front page of the paper, which was already done, essentially, and to write an emergency editorial and get it in the issue. But the tears came anyway, and they came on and off for the better part of a week or longer. And as I wrote this, as I typed this, I had tears. So please forgive me if that should happen again. I have been so privileged, honored, and humbled to have had the good fortune to see and hear Chavez in person on not just one, but on two occasions. 2 times that will be forever etched in my memory, once in socialist Cuba and again in Venezuela. These 2 events influenced me deeply as a revolutionary and a communist here in the belly of the beast. For as much as imperialism hates revolution and communism, as much did Chavez love them, because he loved his people and all the downtrodden and struggling peoples of the world. Chavez to me represented socialism in action and the new man, the new woman, the new society, which revolution can create, and what can be built in a society driven by meeting humanity's needs and not profits for the capitalists. Another famous Chavez and people's leader, the founder of the Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez, is famous for this quote, which I'll read, which, although set in the United States to describe the struggle of immigrant and migrant farm workers, mostly Chicanos and other Latinos, aptly describes the changes wrought by President Chavez and his Bolivarian revolution. Cesar Chavez said, quote, "Once social change begins, it cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read.
You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. We have seen the future, and the future is ours." End quote. That social change began in Venezuela under Chavez's vision and leadership, and it is bound up with the fraternal socialist relations that Venezuela shares with Cuba, and I will talk more about that in a moment. But now I want to get this out of the way and say this. There are some in the movement who would say to us, to Workers' World, "Wait, you quote Cesar Chavez? Wasn't he into nonviolence and boycotts? Or how can you support Hugo Chavez? He was a religious Catholic. Was he even a Marxist? Was he a Leninist? Didn't he support despots around the world?" Or they'll say it's not a real revolution or real socialism being built in Venezuela, that Chavez was just fooling his people into thinking that you can vote your change in society, or other crap like this. Now you hear this awful stuff from organizations like the ISO, the so-called International Socialist Organization, with their disdain for Cuba, Venezuela, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and other independent countries, and their support for the butchery and NATO invasion of Libya and other U.S. interventions. There's plenty of other examples. But let me be crystal clear. Workers' World Party is an internationalist, Marxist-Leninist party that adheres 100% to supporting the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, free from imperialist intervention and domination. Cuba and Venezuela and every country that is trying to build socialism or an independent path has our support, our solidarity, and our unwavering defense against imperialism. As revolutionaries inside the imperialist behemoth, there is no other way. You show support and solidarity, or you take the side of imperialism. There is no third way in the global class war. Workers' World Party sides with the working class and oppressed. So please don't ever confuse Workers' World Party with one of these other groupings. We're just the opposite, and we're very proud of our 54-year history of unwavering internationalist solidarity and defense for every genuine people's struggle for liberation, socialism, or the building of a new society. Whatever language or methods they utilize, we support them. Okay, now back to beloved Hugo Chavez. As much as CNN cheered his demise, they didn't televise, to my knowledge, the surrounding events or the funeral of Chavez. How could they? It would have been in direct contradiction to their lies and coverage of him and his country. But all of that was shown on Telesur, online, and our comrades reported on the massive outpouring that celebrated the life and mourned the death of this great people's leader. And if you haven't, I urge you to pick up a copy of this paper, Millions Mourn Chavez, and read our coverage on that. Comrade Berta Joversisi traveled to Venezuela on many occasions and met with Chavez or sat on the same platform with him several times. She wrote in Workers' World on March 12th, "Chavez's historical significance can only begin to be seen now. Only time and the course of the revolution will show the extent of his historical impact. His importance is not only local in Venezuela, nor even regional in Latin America, but is global. One can write volumes about the legacy of Chavez, including lessons on the role and the tasks of revolutionaries. Chavez changed the history of Venezuela, not only the social and economic projects which have already been written about abundantly. Even more significant is that he involved the masses of the people in the revolution and helped increase their political consciousness. That has been proven by so many comments like, Chavez helped us to know our history, to love, to unite, to value our own worth, to have dignity and national pride. Now the people are aware of their importance in the history and development of their country and region. This is still Comrade Berta writing. One of Telesur's many segments was about the reflections of Chavez while he was in prison after the failed coup of 1992. He mentioned that the prison stay made him understand that only a people with consciousness can be the real driving force to transform society. It is a truly process, the people in motion with consciousness. Chavez was that force combined with the people. On the one hand, he was deeply influenced by the people, wanting to rescue those who for decades had been the victims of right-wing and corrupt rulers who served not the people but foreign capital. In turn, he influenced the people, the masses thirsting for justice. In the process of seeking justice and dignity, Chavez went from the third way, which he at first believed would be the solution to existing neoliberal capitalism, all the way to socialism. As acting President Nicolas Maduro said, when he found through his own experience that with capitalism, and most of all with neoliberal capitalism, it was impossible to stabilize society, provide equality and happiness to the people, impossible to sustain stable, true democracies. One day in December 2004, he said to us, the other leaders of the government, "I will raise the banner of socialism for our America, indigenous, Bolivarian, Christian. We will boldly dare to build that dream of humanity and democracy, socialism." In April 2005, just after Chavez made those remarks to the other leaders that he would raise the banner of socialism, I went to Cuba as part of the U.S.-Cuba Labor Exchange May Day delegation. This was my first time in Cuba, and the emotions I felt when our plane landed in Havana were just too much to even try to describe. But how lucky we would be, because not only we, but the Venezuelans were in Cuba at that time as well, for the launching of the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, the ALBA, or what is now called the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. On April 27th to 30th of that year, more than 1,000 delegates from around the world, along with our grouping from the U.S.-Cuba Labor Exchange, attended the 4th Hemispheric Conference on Struggle Against the FTAA, the Free Trade Areas of the Americas, in Havana. Delegates came to that gathering from over 40 countries, the majority from Latin America. The largest grouping of workers and activists came from Mexico, while the next biggest delegation, with over 50 people, came from the US, including our delegation. At the time, we wrote in Workers' World. This pivotal conference coincided with the first Cuba-Venezuela meeting on the application of the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, which included a major speech by the President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez Frias. President Castro greeted Chavez on the night of April 27th at the Jose Marti International Airport in Havana. Chavez was accompanied by members of his cabinet, as well as hundreds of Venezuelan students, workers, and activists. Chavez came to the socialist island to sign ALBA trade accords with Cuba. On April 29th, delegates to the anti-FTAA conference attended a special session where Chavez and Castro addressed an audience of 6,000 people at the Karl Marx Theater. The two leaders announced the beginning of the implementation of ALBA, a cooperative and non-exploitative trade accord and a consortium started in December 2004. Unlike the FTAA, ALBA
would greatly benefit the working people of both countries. And of course now ALBA is expanded to Ecuador, Bolivia, and it includes others in the region as well. Instead of international trade based on the dominance of big capital and the plundering of other nations' resources and labor, ALBA is based on mutual benefit, solidarity, and increased cooperation and development. Chavez said at the time, the ALBA can be a concrete model for all the peoples and countries of Latin America who oppose the FTAA. The strategic plan drawn up by the two countries stated ALBA's purpose, quote, to guarantee the most beneficial, productive complementation on the bases of rationality, exploiting existing advantages on one side or the other, saving resources, extending useful employment, access to markets, or any other consideration sustained in genuine solidarity that will promote the strength of the two countries. Now, Cuba is a socialist country that at that time in 2005 had faced over 45 years of a criminal U.S. blockade, and now it's been even longer than that. It is a relatively poor country in terms of natural resources, but has tremendous human resources, such as doctors and teachers who have placed Cuba at the top of healthcare and education worldwide. On the other hand, Venezuela has plenty of wealth and natural resources, including oil, but working people and the poor there had little or no access to medical care or education. In Cuba, these services and benefits are considered a right of the people and are completely and universally free of charge. Cuba has already sent, and this was in 2005, at that time, 15,000 medical personnel to Venezuela, as well as thousands of volunteers who are teaching the masses to read and write. Venezuela, in return, is providing much needed oil, technology, and other resources to Cuba. Castro reported while we were there in 2005 that the year before, 20,000 Venezuelans recovered their vision in Cuba. In 2005, it was expected that over 100,000 additional Venezuelans would go to Cuba for restorative eye surgery at no cost. And I believe that figure is about the number that went that year. During our visit, Castro praised Chavez's plan to extend health care to the poorest barrios and throughout the entire country. He pointed to the creation of over 600 diagnostic medical centers and the plans to build 600 physical therapy and rehabilitation centers, as well as 35 high-tech medical centers to provide professional medical services free of charge to the Venezuelan population. Fidel spoke excitedly of the program to assist in training 60,000 doctors in order to help the medical needs of not only Venezuela, but the world, Latin America, for the hundreds of millions who lack medical care. The ALBA Accords that were signed between Cuba and Venezuela at that time also contain provisions for thousands of Cuban volunteers and educators to assist Venezuela in wiping out illiteracy, which they did, and raising the educational level of the masses. Venezuela is the second, next to Cuba, illiteracy-free territory in the Americas, and almost 2 million Venezuelans have learned to read and write. Cuba and Venezuela at that time also joined together on a plan to design a continental project to eliminate illiteracy in Latin America. In all, over 45 major accords and agreements were signed by representatives of the two countries. In addition to continuing to provide Venezuela with assistance in the fields of medical care and education, Cuba would initially acquire over $412 million in Venezuelan goods that would be distributed for the purpose of elevating the living standard of Cuban workers, while at the same time creating 100,000 new jobs for workers in Venezuela. And I believe that they did achieve that as well. The ALBA Accords between the two countries included agreements relating to tourism, communications, transportation, education, sports, biodiversity, the environment, science and technology, hydraulic resources, and construction. The use and processing of crude oil and its derivatives and other raw materials, railway infrastructure, maritime and agricultural development, and plant and animal health were among the many other areas covered in the ALBA Accords between Venezuela and Cuba. So at that special session in Karl Marx Theater on April 29th, Chavez spoke for almost 4 hours. And you might think, oh my gosh, that would be insufferable. How could you stay awake? How could you pay attention? It passed by like 10 minutes, and when it ended, we didn't want it to end. He clarified at that time publicly, for the first time, the nature of the Bolivarian process unfolding in this country. And he said, I want to be very clear about something. In Venezuela, we call our revolution Bolivarian, but it is a socialist revolution. Bolivarian principles are socialist principles. And a thunderous standing ovation met that announcement by Chavez, affirming the struggle for socialism in Venezuela. So it's no wonder that, the US government at that time really stepped up its attacks both against Cuba and Venezuela. They tried to prevent our delegation from even going there, because they don't want workers and poor people in the US to see what socialist planning and cooperation is really all about. And we saw that wonderfully between Cuba and Venezuela. Now, 2 years after that unforgettable trip to Cuba, I was invited to be part of a women's delegation that the party was organizing from the United States to attend the 14th Global Congress of the International Democratic Women's Federation, which was being held in Caracas. It drew several thousand revolutionary women, including many from Cuba and all over Central and South America, as well as from as far away as China and North Korea, and really from all over the world. It was a breathtaking event when President Chavez joined the Congress and carried out his Allo Presidente radio broadcast from the stage as well. The whole auditorium was electrified, with chants of struggle ringing out from the Cubans, the Venezuelans, the Angola delegation, and many other groupings of women from various countries and cultures. When things finally settled down and Chavez began to talk, he didn't say or do what you might think he would. He didn't start out by naming all the achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution, or how women in Venezuela are faring because of increased wages and other measures that had been implemented at the time. No. First, he called up an elder indigenous woman from Bolivia who had a message for him, who beseeched him to help save Mother Earth from the imperialists and the capitalists. He humbly spoke with this humble indigenous leader on the stage for 10 minutes. It was not a shake your hand and be done with it type of thing. He listened to her, he heard her, and he promised her his solidarity and further action. Chavez was a for real revolutionary. He continued by admitting his own problems and what he called failures as a revolutionary when it comes to the woman question. He talked about the legacy of machismo on the continent and how he and really most men were affected with it, how it was a legacy of colonialism and imperialism and had no place in a revolutionary society. He talked about how this struggle impacted him and that he had raised it on numerous occasions to the men in his cabinet and to other leaders, and how overturning machismo and its patriarchal and sexist attitudes and actions towards women was an integral and very serious part of the Bolivarian Revolution. And it was amazing to hear this. The love for Chavez and his love of the women delegates who represented so many struggles were palpable in the huge auditorium. While Chavez announced many of the large groupings in the audience, he asked the women from the U.S. to stand up. And he said, "These are the revolutionary combatants here from the United States who fight in the belly of the beast. We salute you." I tell you, to be called a revolutionary combatant by Chavez was the thrill of a lifetime. Chavez was a man of the people, a people's leader. On March 12th, Jose Pertierra, the attorney representing Venezuela in its attempt to get the U.S. to extradite the terrorist criminal Luis Posada Carriles to that country to face justice, he delivered a moving eulogy to Chavez. And I want to read just a part of it because it shows where Chavez came from and what type of man and revolutionary he was. Pertierra said, "I want to speak a bit about Chavez the man. He was born into a family of very modest means in 1954 in Sabaneta de Barinas, a small town in the Venezuelan plains, a town that had only 3 streets, none of them paved. Hugo was the second of 6 brothers and sisters. He was so poor that his family couldn't afford to buy him shoes. His grandmother, Rosa Inez, took him to his first ever day of classes. Hugo wore a pair of alpargatas that she had made out of soft cloth and rope, but the kindergarten teacher would not allow the little boy into the class until the family could find a way to buy him shoes. President Chavez remembers he had no toys as a boy and said that he made do by playing with his brother Adan imaginary games using imaginary toys. Imagine that. When Americans ask me why there is such an outpouring of emotion among Venezuelans over the death of this man, I point out that the ordinary people of Venezuela saw themselves as President Chavez. The president was a compendium of the very fabric of the country, part black, part indigenous, and part white, a man who came from poverty and whose every decision as president was marked by his humble origins. President Chavez never forgot where he came from, and he always remembered who he was. He dedicated himself to giving a voice to the voiceless, to bringing dignity to a people who had been humiliated for centuries by those in power. To those ends, he empowered the Venezuelan people through the people's assemblies he forged throughout the land. Thanks to President Chavez, everything is open to debate in Venezuela. Everything. For the first time in their history, Venezuelans know how to govern themselves. And that is what the attorney trying to get justice for Cuba and Venezuela had to say about Chavez. Now, this was the message really that the Venezuelan Consul General, Jesus Rodriguez Espinosa, gave us when he spoke here in Detroit on January 31st. He talked about the gains of the Bolivarian masses, of the Bolivarian Revolution for the masses, and the implementation of people's councils to accomplish what needs to be done. One of the achievements that Rodriguez highlighted was the eradication of illiteracy, which was done with the help of Cuban volunteers and that utilized a community-based campaign that involved great portions of the population, including the Army and the People's Councils. He talked about Venezuela having Latin America's highest minimum wage, its unemployment rate dropping to 6.5% in 2010 from 15% in 1999. A 400% increase in the number of retired people who collect pensions at a guaranteed minimum wage, including mothers and homemakers. A 30% decline in infant mortality from 1998 to 2007. An increase in access to water to 98% of the population in 2011. In Detroit, there's at least 40,000 households that have no water. Talked about the great advances in bringing free health care to the poorest areas, again with the help of Cuban volunteers and medical personnel. More than 20 new hospitals are currently being built throughout Venezuela. Rodriguez Espinosa called the communal councils the most important thing achieved in the country. He described how these councils have taken root across Venezuela, involving the masses at many levels. Now Venezuela faces a national election in just a few weeks on April 14th between acting President Nicolas Maduro and a right-wing candidate that I don't believe has been named yet. Maybe
Capriles.
Oh, Capriles. Okay. You can be sure that the machinations of imperialism will be in overdrive to try to undermine and subvert the Bolivarian revolution, the Venezuelan people, the election process, the Venezuelan government, now that Chavez is gone. They never let up when he was alive. Now they're going at it overtime. But the Venezuelan people will fight to not let that happen. And it's time for us to step up our solidarity as well with the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and oppose each and every attempt at U.S. destabilization and intervention. Hugo Chavez will never die. Long live the Bolivarian Revolution and the dream of a united Latin America that he fought for. Long live the fight for socialism. Viva Chavez.
Thank you, Chris. We have two more speakers. We'll hold off on discussion until all the talks are finished. But before I introduce the next speaker, I neglected to thank Debbie for the magnificent meal. Do we have the slides?
The projector wasn't working with my computer for some reason.
Okay, so there won't be
a
slideshow.
slide, unfortunately.
Okay. Maybe we can send it out via email sometime to get it together. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Comrade Abayomi Azikiwe, editor of the Pan-African Newswire, leader of Detroit Workers' World Party. To say he's a frequent contributor to Workers' World newspaper would kind of be an understatement. There's at least one, sometimes two, once in a while, three excellent articles in every issue. Is how I learn about what's going on in Africa. It's how the rest of the world learns about the racist attack on Detroit. It really strengthens our paper, Abayomi's contributions. But tonight, he's going to speak about the life of Comandante Hugo Chavez. Please welcome Abayomi.
All right, thank you so much, Comrade Martha, for that very generous introduction. And I also want to thank Comrade Debbie once again for the wonderful meals that she prepares for us whenever we have these meetings, and also for the classes. So that's another incentive for people to come. Not only do we have great politics, we have the best food in the movement as well. So yes.
Take care of the two most important things.
Exactly. And as Chris so eloquently outlined, the life of Comandante Hugo Chavez Frias, born in 1954 in very humble circumstances in Barinas State in Venezuela. Of course, going on to join the Venezuelan military, largely because there were few other alternatives for young, intelligent men at that time. Chavez was of African, indigenous, as well as Spanish descent, and that's a very important fact to note, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation, because Latin America, just like North America, experienced slavery and colonialism, and today, neo-colonialism. And that is often overlooked by the corporate media, who talks about Latin America or South America as if it really has no history whatsoever, or as if it's some type of Spanish and Portuguese outpost. They neglect the role, of the indigenous people of South America, of the Africans who were imported there in the millions between the 15th century and between the 16th century and the conclusion of the 19th century, and the role these people have played in building South America to what it is today. Also, they neglect the role of the United States in dominating South America for nearly 2 centuries. We remember in school the Monroe Doctrine, this notion that everything in the Western Hemisphere is a concern of U.S. imperialism, that somehow South America is in the, quote, backyard, unquote, of U.S. imperialism. These are the assumptions that the Bolivarian Revolution took on and challenged and made a tremendous contribution in defeating, intellectually as well as politically. And this is very, very important for all of us to recognize and acknowledge. Now, we know the corporate media and the government-controlled media in terms of the capitalists and the imperialists, as soon as Chavez died, they started using little code words like a mixed legacy. What do they mean, a mixed legacy? Here's a man who had millions upon millions of people in his own country behind him. He organized them. They made a tremendous contribution not only to South American and Latin American history, but to world history in general. He also was instrumental in defining and redefining, in a modern sense, the true history and political position of Latin America. And this is very, very important as well.
Absolutely.
Because you have the Organization of American States, which is nothing but a U.S. construct. And they have, for many, many years, attempted to dominate South America, to isolate Cuba. But when the Bolivarian Revolution came to power, Cuba had a staunch ally on the continent. And this movement spread from Venezuela and to other countries throughout the continent, to the extent that the imperialists are now, once again, staging coups d'etats in South America. What happened in Honduras just 3 years ago with the overthrow of President Zelaya? What happened in Paraguay? Last year, there was an attempted coup in Ecuador. They tried to overthrow President Carrera. And of course, in 2002, President Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution defeated a reactionary coup d'etat that was engineered by U.S. imperialism. This was a major contribution to history, because all throughout South America, all throughout Africa and other parts of the world, the imperialists have become experts in staging these military coup d'etats as if they're something legitimate, but they're really designed to force the people back, to rob them of their revolutionary history. And this is very, very important. Chavez became acquainted with the struggle based upon his own personal history. Coming from a humble background, joining the military, doing very well in the military. And then in Marina State, in the late 1970s, they had just crushed a revolutionary insurgency in the area. And the popular view is out there that he actually came upon an abandoned library of Marxist literature and other revolutionary literature and began to read this literature, and this had a profound impact on his life. Now, what I would like to talk about also is in terms of the role of President Chavez in building bridges between South America and the African continent, as well as Latin America and the oppressed African American people here in this country. This is a profound achievement on his part. Now, President Chavez passed away on March the 5th of 2013. And of course, Chavez will be remembered for his efforts in the transformation of Venezuela, Latin America, away from the dominance of U.S. imperialism. This is very important. Simón Bolívar, one of the great revolutionaries in the 19th century, helped liberate Latin America from direct colonialism on the part of Spain. And he was supported and even given refuge by the newly independent Republic of Haiti during the early part of the 19th century. Many people are not aware of that, but in a book that was published recently entitled Haiti, a Slave Revolution, it documents that, in fact, Simón Bolívar was given refuge by the Haitian Revolution. Yes. Chavez championed socialism. He championed national liberation as well as international solidarity. He reaffirmed the indigenous and African roots of Venezuelan and Latin American culture and society. This is important as well because the popular notion in many quarters is that people from Latin America are white, that they're Caucasians. But if you look at the elites there, many of them do identify more with Spain and Portugal than they do with the indigenous people in South America and with Africa. Chavez overturned all of that. This recognition of the African and indigenous heritage of the people of South America opened new avenues for solidarity with the Caribbean, the African continent, and the African American people of the United States. He saw all of these peoples and all these regions as building alliances against U.S. imperialism. After the consolidation of the revolution in Venezuela, the people of Bolivia elected Evo Morales, the first openly and proud indigenous leader within South America since the advent of independence in the 19th century. This was profoundly important. Morales openly, he is indigenous. He doesn't hide it. He's very open about it. And of course, he has had an impact culturally on the peoples throughout the entire continent. The identification and recognition of the non-European character of South American societies is a key element in the cultural revolutions that must permeate all genuine movements for independence and sovereignty. All revolutionary movements have a cultural aspect and a cultural phase. China, South Africa, even inside the United States, we had the so-called Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. In the 1960s, there was a cultural revolution right here in the United States. You know, throwing off the shackles of inferiority, reaffirming, people's cultural identity. It's key in any revolutionary movement. You can't be ashamed of your history and your culture and who you are and then proclaim to be a revolutionary. It's just too much of a contradiction. It will be essential in developing alliances with Africa and the African diaspora, as well as the indigenous communities throughout the Western Hemisphere. And we saw this, and I'll give a few examples. Just prior to the transition of President Chavez, he wrote an open letter to the third Africa-South America summit that was held in Equatorial Guinea, which is a former Spanish colony on the African continent. So Spain not only colonized many of the territories in South America, they also had a few colonies in Africa as well. Now, there was an article that I wrote on this summit that was published in Workers' World newspaper a few weeks ago. In fact, it was the week right before President Chavez made his transition. Chavez reemphasized his call for unity and cooperation between the two continents, noting that this consolidation of both peoples would transform international relations worldwide. You're talking about well over 1 billion people inhabiting Africa and South America. You're talking about tremendous resources, human as well as material resources in these two continents. And they have a common history, not only in terms of their national identification, but also in terms of the struggle against imperialism and colonialism as well as neocolonialism. The second Africa-South America Summit was held in Venezuela on Margarita Island. Yes, which is on the Caribbean, from September 26th to 27th, 2009. At this gathering, there were heads of states representing 61 countries. 49 of them were from the African continent, and an additional 12 leaders came from South America. And Workers' World also covered this conference as well in 2009. So we're on top of all of this. This summit on Margarita Island was held under the banner of, quote, closing gaps, opening up opportunities, unquote. The summit on Margarita Island came in the aftermath of the United Nations General Assembly in New York and the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, which we attended, the protest around the G20 summit in Pittsburgh in 2009, up on the Hill, where we raised the demand for full employment in the United States, for a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions, demonstrations that were attacked by the thousands upon thousands of cops and federal agents who were there in Pittsburgh to stop people from demonstrating against neoliberalism, which is just a new code word for imperialism. President Chavez delivered the opening speech of the summit. This is in 2009, where he stated that, quote, this is the beginning of the salvation of our people. The 21st century won't be a bipolar world. It won't be a unipolar world. It will be a multipolar world, unquote. Chavez continued noting, quote, Africa will be the important geographic, economic, and social pole, as South America will be too, unquote. So he's calling for unity between South America and the African continent. The then Libyan leader, who was chairman of the African Union at that time, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, addressed the summit on the necessity of developing greater unity among developing regions of the world. Gaddafi had just spoken before the United Nations General Assembly as the African Union chairman, who demanded that Africa, Latin America, and other regions of the world be given permanent seats on the Security Council. This is in 2009. Gaddafi gave this long speech before the United Nations General Assembly. They kept passing him notes, telling him to wrap up. He'd open up the note, he'd look at it, he'd close it, and he'd put it down, and he kept on talking. You know. That was the last time he spoke at the United Nations General Assembly. He had a message to get out to the world. Gaddafi said before the General Assembly, quote, that the world isn't the 5 countries on the Security Council.
That's right.
The world's powers want to continue to hold on to their power. When they had a chance to help us, they treated us like animals, destroying our land. Now we have to fight to build our own power, unquote. The development of a secretariat, which was finally agreed upon at the 3rd summit in Equatorial Guinea, was initially proposed by Chavez on Margarita Island in 2009. The Venezuelan Revolution also sparked hope and great identification with Latin America among the oppressed nations inside the United States. In March of 2006, a Venezuelan Solidarity Conference was held at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which I had the privilege of attending with Cheryl Abbas and Judith Thompson. We drove out to Washington, D.C. For that conference. It lasted 3 or 4 days. This conference was attended by over 400 people from throughout the country as well as Canada. The conference was co-sponsored by numerous organizations, including the Alliance for Global Justice, the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, the Artists Network of the Americas, the Antonio Maceo Brigade, the Campaign for Labor Rights, the National Lawyers Guild, the No War on Cuba Movement, Ocean Press, People's Hurricane Relief Fund, Rochester Committee on Latin America, the International Action Center, the Iranian Cultural Associations Incorporated, the Latin American Solidarity Coalition, the Malcolm X grassroots movements, the Hands Off Venezuela, the Global Exchange, Global Women's Strike, the National Immigrant Solidarity Network, as well as many other organizations. It was a truly historic conference in 2006. The gathering brought out that the National Black Legislative Conference, which was a coalition of black state legislators, had adopted a draft bill which called for the U.S. government to respect the independence of Venezuela. These were African-American state lawmakers who had drafted this bill, and they were trying to get it passed in state legislatures throughout the country. This bill had been presented to the Michigan State Legislature by Lamar Lemons III, who's from Detroit here, who's now president of the Detroit Board of Education, in exile, so to speak. But due to the political composition of the body, it did not pass in Michigan, and I don't think it passed in any other state in the United States. But it was still an act of solidarity between black legislators in the United States and Venezuela. This bill read in part that, quote, whereas Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez won the landslide presidential election in 1998 and 2000 with 58% and 59% of the popular vote, respectively, these electoral victories signal the end of a 500-year-old colonial caste system in which an oligarchy of socially, politically, economically advantaged exploited the majority population, unquote. That was a quote from that legislation. The House resolution, it was called House Resolution number 145. It also stated that, quote, whereas all democratic countries must abjure any state-sponsored activities to destabilize Venezuela's economy and or national sovereignty. Further, all public and private American-based entities are conjoined for the sake of international social order and domestic tranquility to vigorously oppose the unconscionable low-intensity war that is being waged against the people and national sovereignty of Venezuela since the inception of the Chavez-Frias administration, unquote. Very progressive resolution. The keynote speaker for the second day of the conference was Antonio Gonzalez, who was the director of the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project. And I want to remind people, 2006 was the opening of the immigrant rights struggle into a mass movement here in the United States. Just a little bit during this period, the first demonstration that was held here in Detroit, we went to it, had 50,000 people that showed up and marched through Southwest Detroit all the way downtown, against this draconian bill that had been put forward in the United States Congress. And then, of course, May Day, that year, 2006, resurrected May Day in the United States. It had been dormant since the period of the Cold War. So we have a debt to our comrades and our brothers and sisters of Latin American descent who resurrected International Workers' Day right here in the United States in 2006. And it has been commemorated every year since then. Last year in New York City, there were anywhere between 50 and 100,000 people who came out and demonstrated on May Day. We haven't seen that type of turnout in many, many years. Now, this speaker, Gonzalez, said, we followed the example of the African Americans and were inspired by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. African Americans are always first in all things good in the struggle for social change. Our movement is not going to get smaller, but better, unquote. This was said by this brother in 2006. Another panel took place which focused on the role of the African population in Venezuela. Jorge Guerrero Veloz of the Afro-Venezuelana organization played a key role in the conference. This organization supports the Bolivarian Revolution and is working to recorrect the historical problems related to the legacy of slavery and racism in Venezuela. There were over 30 workshops at this conference. One took up the question of Venezuela and the African diaspora, and it featured Bob Brown of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, Nellie Hester Bailey, who at that time was with the Harlem's Tenant Council, Dr. Alberto Jones of the Caribbean Children's Foundation. A group called the People of African Descent in Solidarity with Venezuela was formed out of this conference. In addition, a workshop entitled, quote, Indigenous Rights in Venezuela and the Native American Connection, unquote, was also held. This workshop involved Native activists from the U.S. and Canada. The Venezuelan government over the years, through its state-owned oil company, Citgo, provided home heating oil for poor and oppressed communities throughout the United States. Diplomats from Venezuelan embassies and consulates have visited numerous cities to speak before community organizations. We just saw that in January, right here over in Southwest Detroit. In the aftermath of the passing of President Chavez, the Black Left Unity Network set up a blog page that published statements of tribute, sympathy, and solidarity with the people of Venezuela. Statements have come in from various organizations from throughout the country, and that is at blackleftunity.blogspot.com, and you can log on to that site and read those statements. But I just wanted to mention before I go on that in 2005, after the impact of Katrina in the Gulf region, Venezuela offered to send fuel to the United States and ships were prepared to travel here. And also Cuba had hundreds of doctors, so-called barefoot doctors, who had their equipment on their backs, prepared to come to the Gulf area to help the people there, many of whom were African Americans who had been dislocated. Hundreds of thousands, I think 1 million people were displaced as a result of Katrina. And George Bush, who was president of the United States at that time, said, America is a rich country and we don't need their help. So he was speaking for the ruling class, he wasn't speaking for the masses. They would have loved to have the assistance of Venezuela and Cuba during that critical time period when the federal government did nothing except aggravate the horror and the suffering of the people of the Gulf in 2005. Statements were published on this Black Left Unity Coordinating Committee website by the Black Workers for Justice, who we know, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, the Pan-African Newswire, the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, the New African People's Organization, and other organizations. Under President Chavez, the Venezuelan government passed laws banning racial discrimination and including the designation of African heritage in the national census. So he's turning their backs on this denial of the African and indigenous roots of the peoples of Venezuela as well as Latin America. In 2005, in the aftermath of the devastating impact of the Katrina hurricane, I mentioned this before, the Venezuelan government offered to send energy and other assistance to the Gulf, where millions of people were suffering due to the incompetence and the racist neglect of the Bush administration. Although the Bush administration rejected such assistance along with similar offers from the Republic of Cuba, the gesture was well received and served to expose the racist character of the U.S. government in the 21st century. Now, I've talked to people from Africa, and when they saw what happened in 2005, they couldn't believe it. They said, is this the United States that promotes itself as the citadel of democracy, as the most prosperous country in the world? And they have people who, for all intents and purposes, look like refugees in 2005. Because the government wouldn't help them. They wanted people driven out of the Gulf region, out of New Orleans, just like they want to drive us out of the city of Detroit today, and are driving us out. They drove 237,000 of us out in the last census period. Hundreds of thousands of Africans were removed from the Gulf region, and most have not been able to return, representing one of the worst cases of ethnic cleansing and genocide in modern history. This is the reality of the situation. Genevieve Williams Comrie, Executive Director of the Latin American and Caribbean Community Center based in New York City, wrote on the Black Left Unity website that, quote, under his 14-year leadership, Chavez was able to guide unprecedented government initiatives that led to programs and policies that resulted in significant progress towards combating the historical legacy of racism and discrimination that historically plagued the country. Chavez also provided similar parallel support to other nations of predominantly Afro-descendant populations where their governments were not willing to make it a priority. President Chavez was able to institute many reforms to ensure African descendants in Venezuela could have full and equal access to social, economic, as well as cultural rights. From the Caribbean island nation of Barbados, David Camocion of the Clement Payne movement and the People's Empowerment Party pointed to examples of advancement made within the region directly resulting from the work of President Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. He stressed that the, quote, concrete evidence of his success can be found in the current elevated levels of literacy, all of Venezuela's social indicators, and the dominance of socialist and nationalist governing regimes in Latin American countries, ranging from Argentina in the south of the continent to Nicaragua in the north. In the Caribbean states, the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, Venezuela was a part of that. The Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, better known as ALBA, key role played by Venezuela. The Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, the Africa-South America Summit, which I just talked about, the Petro-Caribe Energy Cooperation Agreement, the Bank of the South, Bancasur, the Television Network of the South, Telesur, which is like their answer to CNN, the racist lies that we hear 24 hours a day over CNN, and the list goes on and on in terms of the contributions of Venezuela. Mumia Abu-Jamal, a longtime political prisoner and former member of the Black Panther Party, issued a commentary in honor of President Chavez from his prison cell. At the funeral in Caracas, the Reverend Jesse Jackson of the Rainbow Push Coalition was present and offered a tribute to President Chavez as well. These acts of solidarity over the years have contributed immensely to the anti-imperialist struggle in both the U.S. and Latin America. And in closing, I would just like to mention that in the latest issue of Workers' World newspaper dated March the 28th, 2013, there's a front page article by Kathy Durkin out of New York City where she talks about what's going on now in Europe. They pose no example for the rest of the world. In Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, in Italy, in Belgium, even in France and Britain, people are suffering immensely. In Spain and in Greece, they have unemployment rates over 25%. Retirees are having their pensions cut. People don't have food to eat. You have civil servants who are working and are not being paid. And people may have heard about what's going on in Cyprus, in the Mediterranean, where they have shut down the entire banking system because they have no money, because they've been strangled by the European Central Bank. They were going to take 10% out of people's savings account last week, and it was such an uproar because they knew it was going to be a run on the banks. They closed the banks in Cyprus, and they still haven't opened back up, and it won't open back up until Tuesday. So what example is Europe providing? Right. What example is U.S. imperialism providing for the world? It is South America. It is the Bolivarian Revolution. It is that entire process that's providing the way forward. Right. Thank you very much, brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much, Abayomi. We have one final speaker, Comrade Ray Dupree, a young revolutionary, member of Detroit Workers' World Party, will speak on the world, how the world is mourning our loss and preparing to continue to honor the legacy of Hugo Chavez. Ray?
Good evening, everyone. March 5th, 2013 is a day that will not soon be forgotten. It is the day that Hugo Chavez, the leader of the glorious Bolivarian Revolution, passed away due to cancer. The global reaction to his death showed an overwhelming amount of solidarity and sorrow for Hugo and the people of Venezuela. The strongest show of support, be it from candlelight vigils, speeches, or other events, unequivocally came from the Caribbean and Latin American regions, with nations in East Asia, Africa, and the Middle East following closely behind. Following the announcement by Venezuela's Foreign Minister Elias Hua of 7 days of mourning, which was extended to 11 later, millions poured in the streets of Venezuela to attend Hugo Chavez's funeral. Prior to his funeral and following his death, millions of Venezuelans crowded the streets and public plazas, mourning but also rejoining Hugo. The number of foreign dignitaries attending Hugo's funeral were astounding. And I believe it broke a record too, over 30 heads of state from various countries globally and numerous other government representatives, as well as representatives of the EU and the UN, were present. Dignitaries of nations that stand opposed to imperialism or even are not directly under the thumb of it, as well as dignitaries from imperialist countries. Even the Crown Prince of Spain, Felipe, was at the funeral. Prominent anti-imperialist figures who attended the funeral included Cuban President Raul Castro, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad sent a message of his condolences as he could not make it because of the U.S. imperialist war happening there. The importance of Chavez in the struggle against imperialism can be found in President Ahmadinejad's statements, in which he claimed that Hugo Chavez is a martyr and will soon return with Jesus and the Imam Mahdi on Resurrection Day. Considering he is the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, these words definitely should not be taken lightly. The president, and this is what really struck me personally. President of Bolivia, Evo Morales, broke into tears as he spoke on television about the death. He said he felt destroyed. It hurt, but the struggle for liberation in the region continues, and that's of the utmost importance. As Bolivia is a recent example of the fight against imperialism. Bolivia recently kicked out Bechtel Corporation, an American firm based in San Francisco that had been given complete control of the nation's water supply. That's not it. That's not even it. At the end of 2012, Bolivia also kicked the Coca-Cola Corporation out. It is near impossible to, it is literally not impossible to not be moved by Evo Morales' display in words. It is exactly as if he lost a brother, which, in fact, we did lose a brother in the fight against imperialism. Hugo was a vital figure for the oppressed globally, not just within Latin America and Caribbean regions. There were memorial actions and candlelight vigils internationally, from London to Gaza. Even in the biggest imperialist nations, there was a solidarity for the passing of the popular leader. In New York, a chapter of the SEIU held a candlelight vigil and a memorial march, which ended at the statue of Simon Bolivar in Central Park, which I had no idea existed, and I plan on going to see after I read that. In San Francisco, Marxists and other leftists held candlelight vigils as well. With Hugo's passing, the Bolivarian Revolution does not die, as Evo Morales said in his words. The struggle against neoliberalism and imperialism in Venezuela continues as Vice President Nicolas Maduro assumes the presidency. The people of Venezuela, the millions that poured in the streets after Hugo's death, will ensure that no form of counter-revolution reaction will occur. The Bolivarian Revolution is inextricably tied to the struggles of other oppressed nations like Syria, Iran, Gaza, and it is tied up with the future of socialism as a whole. And Viva the Bolivarian Revolution, Hugo Chavez presente.
Right on.
Okay, in a minute we'll, thanks Ray, thanks for all three speakers. Give another round of applause. In a minute we'll open the floor for discussion, but we want to recognize a well-known activist here, Margaret Goodshaw of the Michigan State Greens, who has a few remarks on the passing of Comandante Chavez.
Good presentation, right? Thank you.
Incredible looking at this room from this angle. You guys all look so beautiful today.
You look pretty good yourself.
Thank you very much. Okay, oh wow. Hello friends and comrades. I'm very happy to be with you all today and to celebrate the life of Hugo Chavez. I'll say a few words about Hugo Chavez and about our friend Arturo Vandeninde, who died one day earlier 10 years ago. I saw Hugo Chavez for the first and only time at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 2003. So I share something with Chris. It's wonderful to see him alive. He was such, anyway, I'm getting away from my written speech.
That's okay.
Anyway, I saw him, he came out to a balcony. There was 2 or 3 stories above us in Porto Alegre, and he started speaking to us. And he was a very impressive speaker, and he spoke Spanish. In those days, before I got hit by the 18-wheeler, I used to understand Spanish, and I could totally what he said, but I can't anymore. Evidently, there's a big 18-wheeler out there that's got a great knowledge of Spanish. Okay. There were thousands of people there from all over the world. And I don't know if you guys know what a World Social Forum is like. It's absolutely huge. There were people there from all over the world. And when I think about the fact that Hugo Chavez was the leader of the Venezuelan people, I realize how really strong we are. If you look at Hugo Chavez and what he's accomplished in his life, it gives you a glimpse of how incredibly strong the Venezuelan people are. And if you look at the countries that had set events, had set heads of state, the event marking his death, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Cuba, you get a feel for how indescribably strong the opposition to U.S. imperialism is. We're going to win. It's just a matter of time.
There you go.
Right. Our friend was born with the name Arturo Vandeninde, but he joined the movement in order to overthrow the fascist dictatorship in Spain and adopt the name Aníbal Ramos. He was known by that name for many years until the movement made a bit of a progress and he was able to go back to using his real name. In those days in Barcelona, which is Catalonia, it's not even Spain, everybody was underground. Everybody, all the time. That's the way they did it. They didn't have any Marxist books in their house, nothing. I got a copy of a Marxist book made to look like the Bible. Wow. You know, that's the way that it was in those days. I first met Arturo in 1976. We were part of an organization called the International League, Rebuilding the Fourth International. And I just want to tell you something about the guy who was speaking about Bolivia. There's no question that the Trotskyists were really strong in Bolivia. We worked together for many years, and I learned so much from Arturo. You all have his book. Globalization, the Dictatorship of 200 Corporations. Or was kind enough to carry that. And I want to show you something else he made. This, oh goodness, there goes my speech. This is a picture of me working at the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees office, and that was painted by Arturo. I'm going to give it to you and you can pass it around. And I'm the little head there. I don't know if you guys know about it, but the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Union was one of the unions that endorsed the Labor Party. So they gave me space and I worked in there as a volunteer. And I told that to Aníbal, Arturo, and he imagined it in his own mind and he sent me that. Okay. And here's another thing that Arturo made. It's a lighthouse with a ship, and the ship has my name on it. So, when Arturo was young, he was artistic and he learned how to make beautiful things. As he got older and was deciding what to do with his life, he thought, there are lots of beautiful things in the world. I can make artistic representations of them. But the most beautiful thing in the world is the working class and oppressed people fighting for their own liberation and winning. I think I'll be a revolutionary, help make a successful revolution, first in one country and then the whole world, and then around the world.
Absolutely.
And he was true to this until the day he died, which is March 4th, 2003. So the last time I saw him was the same place I saw Hugo Chavez for the first time, the World Social Forum 2003. Both of them will live forever in my heart and in my mind, and in the hearts and minds of people all over the world.
Right on.
Viva Hugo Chavez! Viva Arturo Vandeninde! Viva la Revolution Socialiste Communiste!
All right.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for those marks. Really strengthened the whole program. Margaret. Okay, I'll open the floor up for comments and also questions for any of our wonderful speakers. Okay, Lee, and then Debbie, and then Bill. Go ahead, Lee.
One of the times that we visited Cuba, and we went with the UAW group too, we had a free afternoon, free from the schedule, and so several of us went down into the older part of Havana and were tourists really. But I got tired and the rest of them went on, and I sat down on a bench. And lo and behold, here 5 men, all dressed in red shirts, came walking by. You can see, you know, from the picture. But the red shirts didn't say Venezuela to me then. I knew about Chavez, though, because I'd read about him in the Workers' World and newspaper. And I'd already learned to love him and what he was doing in Venezuela, but I didn't recognize them as being Venezuelan. Anyway, they apparently all looked at us and at me, and 4 of them must have said, nah, she's American, and walked on, you know, because they can always tell if you're American. Anyhow, the 5 of them walked on, but then one of them stopped, turned around, looked right at me, and said, Chavez? And I said, oh, yes, Chavez, you know? And he was so happy, you know? You could tell he loved it. He loved Chavez, and all of them did. Then I realized, you know? I mean, that doesn't sound like very much, but that was a great experience for me.
And number of people have mentioned the Workers' World newspaper. Please pick up a copy and get a subscription. It's a great way to really get the real truth that you don't read in the capitalist media.
Yeah,
Debbie?
make sure you read it, our paper.
Yeah.
Read the 1% paper alone.
Read our paper and then go back and read the 1% paper, and you'll be able to sift out the lies and take what you can take from it.
I'll have time.
Good to know what they're saying.
First read ours.
Okay, Debbie. Debbie?
Well, I just wanted to say, when I have 4 children. My older daughter was visiting before the meeting, and she was talking about how she was so taken by, she saw a news clip of Chavez funeral, and she said it was amazing to her to see how much these people loved him. She said, Mom, they were just crying, all of them. It was just tears, you know, and you know, that's people, I mean, that's what people recognize, is what the expression of love and support in times of grief, when you lose someone, and the significance of this man, you know, and how important he was to the Venezuelan people, was etched in the faces and the tears of tens of thousands, millions that came out to support him. I can't think of one president or anything else in this country that could generate even a tenth of that kind of response in this country. You know, it was just tremendous. Another thing that she brought up to me, and I was glad that someone actually said it, I don't know if it was Abiyumi, is Coca-Cola. She's taking some classes, and she said that she has to write in one of her classes what the impact of American business practices have over the world, you know, what it's like. So she said she's a Googler. You know, I know there's a lot of y'all Googlers in the room. Well, she Googled it. And her question was, who's the bad corporation in the world, you know, in terms of this world businesses? Coca-Cola. She said it was absolutely at the top. She goes, Mom, they be murdering people and they just do anything, Mom. You know, she was like appalled. She said, yes, that's what I'm writing about. I know my professor, she gonna understand, Mom, because she's anti-imperialist, I think. You know, and you know, she's going on, and she said, yes, and at the end, I'm gonna say, they have to get rid of this Luciferi, you know, she's a devil, you know, anti-devil. So she goes, this Luciferian atmosphere of business, doing business the world over that justifies killing people, you know. And I just, what the significance of it is that, you know, my kids have known that we're political forever, since they were really quite young. And but when they connect the dots to the reality of the world they see every day, to what we have been doing all these decades, it's good. Because I know that she will never be persuaded to defend or protect the imperialist you know, the ruling class. Never. I don't have to be concerned about that. But it's important that she comes to that on her own. That, you know, she sees, you know, the contradictions, the murder and mayhem, the destruction that profiteering and imperialist endeavors around the world generate. I didn't have to tell her that, although I've been telling her that for years. She found that on her own, and it's just, that's what we need people to do. That connect the dots, to begin to put a face of reality on the role of U.S. imperialism and global capitalism around the world. It is not pretty. And if people need to understand why there is such disdain and hatred for capitalism in the U.S., because the history that that capitalism has, laid in its waste around the world of wars and invasions and occupations, that is, that's what we have to convey to people, the reality. It just because it didn't happen here, don't mean that it didn't happen. It's happening all over the globe, and that we have to get people in the world, in this country, to understand that this whole notion about, protecting democracy, they're not even protecting democracy within the borders of this country. Why would they ever be concerned about democracy somewhere else? So, this is what we have to do. We have to crack that wall of ignorance and in the propaganda machine, and bring the truth of what is happening in the world. We don't have to make it up. It's happening. We just need to make sure that people know it. Thank you.
Okay, sister in the back, and then Larry.
Didn't Bill, wasn't Bill there?
Bill, did you? Susan. Bill, did you have a comment? Or no? Did you have your hand up earlier? Okay. Susan.
Okay, yeah, after
Larry?
what she said, that like what you were saying about we have to notice this or do this everywhere. When you were making announcements, because I'm new here, but as I left the house, this was still in process of being put together, but I can get a hold of you by your website. John Bolenbaugh, he lives in Kalamazoo, and he's the one that really worked hard to find out how polluted the river is there. And he's coming up here Wednesday, and what we're going to try to do, we're going to try to get at least 30 to 50 people. Code 48217 by Del Rey is the third most toxic zip code in the United States. And Marathon, which has been hogging and they've been hiding in Maddie Maroon the tar sands that they're going to be using for the oil. And there's already been a few spills. And I went to a meeting, and just to hear the people that live there, the amount of cancer it just broke my heart. I don't think I'll ever be the same. So if anybody wants to come down there, as soon as we find out exactly if we're going to be able to do it this soon, to come march with us and protest the tar sands being put in a marathon over. So that you know about it, because I'm sure it'll be a big media blackout. You may get arrested. That's right.
Well, we're absolutely in solidarity with that struggle, and if we can get the time and place, we'll send it out to we have a number of lists that we notify people of, and you're welcome to come back to our Moratorium Now meeting and make an announcement, give a little talk on Monday at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, it's Monday at 7.
That would be great.
Okay.
Okay.
If I can't, I'll at least get it through the.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Larry, Chris, Jerry, and guy in the back.
Fred.
Yeah, I see. Oh, go ahead, Larry.
All right, good thing you said that, because like I was just talking to Debbie and Martha. Say we live in a fascism country right now. We just don't know it. They just killing us slowly but surely. GMO, toxic waste, chemical spray in the sky. I mean, all this cancer, heart attack. We get more cancer and heart attack anywhere around the world. But this is what I want to talk about. Anybody want to see Chavez, Dr.